Okay, so barring further questions, I'll get going, and please do use the chat or your hand if you others questions come up as always, and if you have questions about the Wordsworth as we get going on that discussion. I was mentioning that the theme of the course is time and history, and we've mostly talked about time in the sense that there's, first of all, there's narrative time and there's story time. We've talked about that a couple times within all works, all literary works. We've talked about the notion of how time, or the notion of a person or a character's history, is looked at differently as they narrate it in the past tense. So in Odysseus and Aeneas's case, their personal history or the history of Rome is seen in a different light as it's narrated in the past. So that was something we highlighted. We talked about time in the sense of time as a theme. Time is a theme in the sense that both in the Old English literature and in Shakespeare's sonnets, time's passing was a problem. How do we make meaning out of our lives if it's moving so quickly and we're not the same as we were in the past and we're going to die? So death and mortality is facing our future, and what we were is gone. So how do we make meaning out of that temporal flow? So mostly it's been about time, and the one references to history that we've discussed in relationship to Aeneas is about a particular notion of history as events that happen. Okay, so our modern notion of history, or the historical view, is what arises in the 19th century, and we're first going to have to start to encounter that with Wordsworth, with the Romantics, and we'll talk a bit about that tonight. So what I mean by that is, in every other age, things may have happened in the past. So let's say if you're Aeneas, you're looking back to the Greeks and you look back to the Trojan War, and you know that those are events that happened in the past, and you're trying to rewrite them, or trying to frame them for Roman history, but you have a sense that human nature and the essence of human activity is always the same. So history, as though those historical epochs are not incommensurable divisions or things that separate us from another time, another historical moment. So beginning with the 19th century, there's this kind of discovery of history, it's been called, discovery of the notion that ages in the past had their own sets of ideas, their own sets of beliefs, and that we can't refer to some sort of enduring human nature that connects us, and that could be the arbiter. History is the ground of human development, and it's the only ground of judgment, so to speak. So we can't look to the past and say, well, they did that wrong, and that's against human nature. We look at the past and they say, well, they had a different historical belief system. They thought differently than we do. So we're going to have to keep that in mind. It can lead, potentially, as it does later on in the 20th century, to a certain historical relativism. So I mentioned that in our first lecture, but for now, I'll just say that in the 19th century, it didn't really lead to a historical relativism, because in the 19th century, generally speaking, people thought that there was a rational pattern in history. So you could still make value judgments on what form of life, or those were errors in the past, or because we can see through the rational pattern of history that we've developed, or we've progressed to a more enlightened view, so to speak. So that, as I said, was basically abandoned later on in what we'll call the third wave of modernity in the 20th century and onward. Okay, so in terms of the theme of the course, we're going to look at time in Wordsworth for sure. Time is an important category in the poem, but also within the context, less so in Wordsworth's poem, but in the context of the romanticism, and we'll talk about that, the romanticism within which he's working. There's a notion of history as a category that replaces human nature as an enduring category. So let's get started with this PowerPoint to guide the discussion, as always. So the poem we read tonight is called Tintern Abbey, and this is a picture of the site. It's I was actually there a few years ago. I was in Wales for a conference, and it's decided to take a tour out there, you know. And it's a beautiful, beautiful location. Actually, all of Wales is just beautiful, and it's quite an awe-inspiring site and building and edifice for a number of reasons. One of which is this sense of ruin. Okay, so. And this is very much a romantic. I'm leaving it on the cover page here, so you get some sort of sense of this edifice. So this Tintern Abbey is, or was, or is, it still exists, right? This ruin exists, but when it was a vibrant operating building, it was an abbey that housed a monastic community, right? So that's what abbeys are. It's a monastic community of maybe 100 monks there, ruled by an abbot. That's why it's called an abbey. And they would do their religious rituals. They would be working on their manuscripts. They would have regimens of prayer. And the building itself has that medieval kind of sublime essence to it. It's bigger than you would expect a normal building to be. You know, it has kind of flying arches. It has incredible architectural feats, and then it's fell into decay because in the early 16th century, Henry VIII dispossessed the church of its possessions. So he took over, declared himself the head of the Church of England, and said that all those lands, those properties belonged to the head, the royal head of England, as opposed to the Catholic Church. So it fell into disuse and started to decay. So it would have looked like this basically like this when Wordsworth saw it at the beginning of the 19th century. So it had been decaying for a couple of centuries. You know, no more stained glass windows, no more roofs, and falling in, and definitely not having been used for a couple of hundred years. So what's let's say a typical romantic setting about that is that it evokes this notion of the sublime. So it evokes this notion that there's a power that transcends our rational scope of comprehension. And that power is the fact that we have this huge, majestic building that is kind of the ultimate of human craft and ingenuity, and that has been built to stand the test of time. But there's this larger force that exceeds our frame of reference even beyond that, which is nature and time. Nature and time wear away at that through hundreds of years and eons and it will continue to happen for eons and millions of years that we can't assess. And as I said, that's outside of what we can really comprehend in a frame of reference. So other sublime images for this period are let's say a stormy ocean, or an ocean that you can't see the other shore of it. It's just this power, this force of nature that is something that can't be fathomed. I think we're looking into space. You know, you can look at looking into the starry sky, you kind of get the same sense that you can't fathom the distances. You can't fathom how many stars there are that you can't see. There's maybe thousands that you can see, but there's billions, hundreds of billions that you can't see. So these are the a typical, let's say, experience celebrated by the Romantics because it calls into questions the limits of what we normally perceive. It calls into the question our rational frameworks and says that there's something beyond that. So sublime is from Latin. It's the same roots, the same stem as we get subliminal. You've probably heard that word. So it's subliminal. It's from Latin for sub, so it's beneath. Liminal, the threshold. So sublime is below the threshold of what we can sense. So subliminal gives you a sense that it's kind of operating in the background that you can't notice, and it's below in the sense of being inferior to what's conscious. But sublime for them is it's below the threshold, but it's greater. It's surpasses in every way our rational categories. So that's a bit already about the setting and a bit already about kind of this romanticism, which is the aesthetic outlook that started to be shaped around the time that Wordsworth is writing in England. So the early 19th century, late 18th century. And we're going to talk more about that. We're going to talk about the context about that in this lecture before we get to the poem. So part of the context is Immanuel Kant, and we'll talk very quickly about how Kant's philosophy started to shape what we could call the second wave of modernity. We'll talk a bit more about romanticism and aesthetics, or the aesthetics of romanticism. We've mentioned it briefly as we talked about the actual site of Tintern Abbey. We'll talk, let's say, the historical context of the what we could call the Age of Revolutions, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. We'll talk about some themes that we find in Romantic literature. Remember here, we're not using romantic in the sense of having to do with love. We're talking very specifically about romanticism as a cultural movement that happened in this particular period. So it can apply to visual arts, it can apply to literature, music, philosophy, interpretations of history. So it's a broad cultural movement that has to do with, largely, we'll talk about it, but largely a reaction to the Enlightenment and, let's say, an over-evaluation of reason. Then we'll talk about the poem as such, okay? So here, another excellent visual image of romanticism. This is Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. So it's from 1818, so kind of the height of the Romantic period. And so Friedrich's painting shows the solitary visionary looking out over this sublime landscape. So mountains, a sea of fog. We can't make out shapes underneath that. Part of that landscape is you get the sense shaped, so to speak, by the visionary, who's the wanderer, who's looking out over those cliffs. Okay. So let's talk about Kant very quickly. So I'm going to remind ourselves that we've talked a bit about it. We talked about the first wave of modernity when we talked about the background to Shakespeare's sonnets. We talked about the modern revolution, let's say around the turn of the 16th century, around that period, in a lot of fronts. We talked about linear perspective in painting. We talked about the Copernican revolution. We talked about Protestantism, early capitalism. So a lot of different fronts brought to bear a modern revolution with respect to the way of seeing the world and operating in the world, in contradistinction to the classical way of doing these things. Now, The second wave of modernity is where we are now. So in looking at Wordsworth, and they're going to be reacting to some of the, let's say, the blind spots of that first wave. So that first wave celebrated their scientific achievements during the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment, and we're quite excited by the fact that through Newton's discovery of the laws of gravity and by turning ourselves to these rational endeavors, that there was a belief that humanity could really take control of nature, discover its secrets, and really be in charge of humanity's own destiny, so to speak. So the second wave, and this kind of the romanticism that's part of the second wave, is a reaction to that overemphasis on humanity's ability to rationally apprehend and truly come to grips with the universe. So in referring to it in three waves, I'm using Leo Strauss's framework there. I refer in that slide where he lays it out fairly clearly there. He talks about it elsewhere, but in that essay, The Three Waves of Modernity, if you're interested. So there's a couple of figures. We'll look at Kant quickly, but the other figure there is Rousseau, in terms of being really crucial in terms of moving from the first to the second wave. And I'll just remind you what I said, some key elements of the first wave of modernity. Okay, so I mentioned there's a lot of things happening: Protestant Reformation, linear perspective, science, etc. But if we were to sum a lot of that up, the key, let's say, shift from when it comes to early modernity in relation to the classical approach to nature is that in the classical view, things have a purpose or a telos, okay, T-E-L-O-S. So that's an end or a purpose or an intention. So a tree has it, or the acorn has an end or a purpose to grow into the adult tree, and maybe you might say, okay, well, and I think the purpose of that tree is to provide shade or to provide wood for this and the wood for that community, is the purpose of that is for housing, for shelter, for sheltering humans, and well, the purpose of shelter is for this. And so there's a series of ends, and the human philosophic endeavor is to try to understand the end of all ends, which is kind of divine intention for all things. Now, in the modern revolution, they said, okay, well, we've been arguing about what's the purpose of that and what does that really mean for eons, and we haven't come to satisfactory answers. So I don't think that that's a category that needs to be put into the analysis. So the final, what's Aristotle called the final cause of things, the end, the purpose, is something that can be discarded. And this was done by Francis Bacon, who first made the philosophical case for this, and posited instead an empirical scientific approach that just looks at efficient and material causes as the primary things that we need to look at in the world. We need to look at the actual material causes of things, what's the matter behind them, and efficient causes. Was there something that acted on that, or did someone throw that billiard ball, that kind of thing. We don't need to try to ascertain whether or not there was a defined intention behind all of this. So the modern revolution discards this notion of ends, both in the approach to nature, but also in the approach to the human things. So the political things, social things, there isn't an end in terms of how we ought to live together. There's just a community, a society shouldn't tell you what your purpose is or what your goal is. They're just there to satisfy the means for you to satisfy your own individual ends. So this is kind of the foundations of, let's say, modern liberalism. Is the state is there really to is really there to ensure that we have adequate means. So we're not, none of us are starving. We can have a right to I don't know, water, internet, whatever right we need now to get by. And in actuality, what happens, of course, is if in a communal situation we don't have a common end or common purpose to our lives, and all we can agree on in terms of what is important is the means, so if money and certain amount of fame are really successful means to prospering, and then that becomes the communal standard upon which good lives are judged, right? So lives are judged on the means to individual ends as opposed to individual ends, because we can't have common discussions around individual ends. And then also, as I highlight here, what that also can mean is that education can become a form of accreditation as opposed to an education to virtue. So the classical form of education was one where your education is a bringing forth of the individual to their virtue, which equals their end, their purpose, their goal. In the modern age, that can become, as I said, a certain accreditation, that the education allows them to get a job, make the money they need to get by. So that's roughly the first wave of modernity. The second wave of modernity, so remember, in the first wave of modernity, nature is still a standard. It's just that it doesn't have an end or purpose. Okay, it's not nature with a divine or its own inherent purposes, so it can be molded to human will. Okay, now in the second wave of modernity, there is no, let's say, common nature to human endeavor. So history replaces nature as the foundation for understanding beings, but history has an end, or a telos, okay? So history can be a ground on which to judge the rightness of behavior, etc. So we are progressing, that according to this, it's kind of a Hegelian point of departure. We're progressing toward an end of history, and the vantage point of the end allows us to judge previous epochs and previous, let's say, value systems, previous ways of living, in terms of how close they are to that which is good and true, the end, okay? So we're celebrating liberal democratic rights where individual liberties and universal human rights are celebrated. We look back and we don't see that valued as much in the Greeks, and we can judge them from according to this view, we can judge them from the high point of the end of history. I think there's some of that thinking that lingers. This, I'm talking about kind of a Hegelian 19th century view, but I think there's still some of that thinking. We look back and we say, boy, well, we've got some things to work on, but we're at such a high point of enlightenment when it comes to recognizing the dignity of life, the dignity of other humans. We're starting to try to grant other species more rights. The other epochs had such blind spots to that. So we, in some ways, although we don't like to, it's a no-no to use the word progress in kind of today's relativistic age. We don't want to use that word, but I think there's a certain assumption of progress in still when we look to the past and see their lacunae, their blind spots or their limits. Okay. Then the third wave of modernity, beginning with Nietzsche probably and others, starts to see the limits of this historicism. And basically the point of departure of that is to say, okay, well, if your insight is that every age has a historical view, it is historically limited, so to speak, and is a product of its age. Every insight is a product of its age. If that's your point of departure, then you cannot refute that there may be another historical age that has a different and insight that usurps yours. Okay, so you have a particular way of looking at the world that sees the situatedness of worldviews in their historical age. You relativize that. You say that there's no eternal truth that goes beyond every age, but there could be other ages, if according to your own principles, that have a different view that may be as true or more true than yours. So there's a certain paradox in the historical point of departure. So for Nietzsche, he's saying, well, first of all, there's not going to be an end of history. There's always going to be new historical positing, and what that means is that you can't judge from one to another at all. So this is where we get a certain historical relativism. Nietzsche tried to provide the grounds for judging those in different metaphysical principles: the will to power, the affirmation of the eternal return. Like, is it a culture? Is it an individual or a culture that could affirm the eternal return of its culture? Is it a culture that cultivates the will to power to the highest degree? Then we can say that that's a good way of living for humans. Then we can say that that's a productive culture. So he looks back at the Greeks and sees that. He looks at modern Germany, modern Europe, and he doesn't. He sees it as a decaying culture. So Nietzsche thought he was trying to provide some sort of ground for judging historical epochs, to try to avoid historical relativism. But the point of departure leads us to, I think, post-Nietzsche is, and people who build on Nietzsche, is really one lost in kind of this historical relativism. So this is a way of summarizing those three waves very quickly. I won't go through every section, but I leave it to you. And so on the top is the top row is classical versus the three waves. Some key thinkers, just so you know who's where on those ages. Then there's a certain concept of the way things are, or the concept of truth or being. So the concept of the way things are for each, and a short way of phrasing that at the bottom. So nature, and nature has an end or purpose, would be the classical view that I tried to summarize with the oak tree example. And then for the first wave of modernity, nature, but it doesn't have a purpose. So it can be molded to human ends. And then the second wave, well, there is no universal human nature or an enduring human nature. Humans are always evolving. And it's not surprising that it was in the 19th century that we get a Darwin, for instance, that sees evolution or let's say nature itself as having a history. So it's history with a telos. We can see it as progressing to a certain end within the Hegelian framework. And then, as I said, in the third wave, we have still an assumption that history, that things do evolve and change, that it's a constant becoming, so to speak, but that there's no end or purpose or vantage point from which to look out and judge the previous periods. So I've shown you this as kind of a way of looking at our authors before. So just a reminder, we're here, Wordsworth, and he's at the beginning of this second wave of modernity. And he's in this, when it comes to aesthetic or literary periods, this period of Romanticism. And we had just finished looking at Shakespeare and Milton, who were in this first wave of modernity, okay? So Kant, so he's largely considered the greatest modern philosopher. His revolution really is he called a Copernican revolution in knowledge. So it's in his seminal work, The Critique of Pure Reason. It's a Copernican revolution in that he inverts the order of knowledge of the subject and object, much as Copernicus inverted what was the center, Earth versus the sun. Okay, so So normally, or in the thinking about how we know things, following on Descartes, which is the first wave of modernity, we have a subject that is merely mirroring an object, and the truth is to get at a sort of faithful description of that object. Okay, so what Kant does is say, well, actually, the object's what's not available. What the subject's first, and that's what's available to us. And it's the subject that is structuring reality ahead of time, all the time. Okay, so sometimes Kant's way of thinking about what the human mind, how the human mind is interacting with the world, is to think about how a software, like let's say the Excel software, is processing the data that is entered into it. So the Excel software is going to process it in a different way than if I'm entering numbers on, I don't know, Word document even, right? So it's going to enable certain mathematical functions, tables that the Word document won't allow. So just the raw numbers is kind of like the sense stimuli that we're getting from the world all the time. Okay, so Kant's point of departure is that we don't have any, say, unstructured view of the things as they are. They're always structured ahead of time by that software, so to speak. Okay, it's not as though we're saying, oh wow, look at this. If we look at, in the equivalent of that analogy, we look at a table that comes up to a great sum at the bottom of my Excel formula, that is my mind. We can't go out to the world and say that's going to match one-to-one with the object, and that thing in itself is forever, we have no access to it. So this is in contradistinction to empiricists such as Bacon, I mentioned, but also John Locke, that's indicated on this slide. So Locke had indicated that the objective world impressed its categories on a blank slate. So our minds are like a blank slate. It's a tabula rasa, and the objective world, the world out there, impresses that mind, and then we take a look at it, and we're getting a very clear, unmediated representation of the outside world. So for Kant, there's these forms of intuition. So even space and time. So space and time, remember the theme of the course, time itself for Kant is something that we're imposing on experience. Okay, so we're dragging experience out. We're giving it a temporal order. We're giving it a spatial dimension, and then we add these other categories such as substance and causality. So his point of departure was was to try to come to terms with the success of modern science when it came to the physical world. So modern science and mathematics were extremely successful in kind of the physical world, but there seemed to be getting no closer to trying to understand things that were really important to Kant. So Kant had this very moral upbringing, and so a famous kind of a quote I like of his is that he always felt an awe for, quote, the starry heavens above and the moral law within us. His problem is that how can science, so modern science, the age of reason, so Isaac Newton and all these great scientists of the 17th and 18th century had made such advancements, how could they lead to ever greater leaps of knowledge and certainty with respect to the starry heaven above? But it had only led to skepticism when it came to, it only led to questions about what is true when it came to questions about moral law, religion, the moral law within us. So religion, ethics, those types of things, all it raised are questions. And maybe there are no moral laws. Maybe it makes no sense to be good, these types of things. So that was his point of departure, that problem. And he was piqued by this other philosopher, David Hume, who had really pointed out the limits of empirical philosophy. So his own tradition, the English tradition of empiricists, he pointed out that you can never be certain. You can never get to a certain amount of knowledge through empirical knowledge. So an example he would use is because the point of departure with empirical knowledge is that you can be certain of something if you observe it enough times and you don't see outliers, basically. So as opposed to deductive knowledge. So deductive procedure is, I know this is absolutely true. I know that 2 + 2 = 4, and I'm going to get these apples here, and so there's 2 over here and there's 2, so I know I've got 4. So I'm operating deductively there. I've got something that I can anchor my kind of knowledge calculus on there. So if you're strictly going from empirical knowledge, you don't have any recourse to something that is true a priori, like before any experience. Then you're going to be led to Hume points out, you can never be certain of anything. Okay, so even something he says like the sun will come up tomorrow, what I call the Annie hypothesis. So the sun will come up tomorrow, and the Annie hypothesis, it's an old musical, maybe, so check it out. So Hume would point out that if we just take kind of empirical knowledge, we know, well, it came up yesterday, it came up the day before, came up the day before that, but you never know, something could happen, could get hit by a meteor, something, you never know. The sun may not come up tomorrow. We don't know that for absolute certainty, okay? We don't know that 2 + 2 = 4 with absolute certainty if we only go by counting. You know, like we're not going to be able to prove the laws of math just from empirical. Well, in that case, 2 + 2 = 4, but I haven't counted chairs. Let's go count chairs. 2 + 2 chairs. Oh, it does equal 4. Okay, 4 chairs does. So let's count whatever, you know, so you're not going to get to some sort of absolute certainty in that procedure. So Kant says Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber, and he had to undertake on his critique of pure reason. So there's limits to pure reason because the sciences are approaching. He felt their success with the let's say the starry world around us was that they were approaching the categories of the mind. They were approaching things as per the categories of the mind, and the other questions that he wanted to have asked, and that, you know, Hume was saying we could never get certainty on, were categories that were beyond the categories of the mind. So science deals with reality as experienced or as it appears in the phenomenal world, you know, as spatial categories, as temporal categories, and as already structured by the mental faculties. So we can you know, have accuracy of measurement there and that type of thing, but we need to, let's say, go beyond that to a kind of critique, you know, to see the limits of pure reason and see what is it in the mind's structuring of reality that we're really assessing when we say that something's 14 feet away or whatever. So here's a quote just in terms of how time is one of the categories. Time is the a priori formal condition of absolutely all appearances. Space, as the pure form of all outer intuitions, is an a priori condition only for them. So only if I'm experiencing kind of an outer phenomenon, like if I see a horse running, then I need space. But if I'm having an inner experience, I don't necessarily need space as a category, but I still need time for that experience to happen. Or if there's no time, I'm not experiencing it. So time for Kant is always present as a category that we're structuring reality with. Let's move on here. So here's a kind of a diagram I tried to create here of what's going on. So you've got the thing in itself, which on the left, which we don't have access to. So let's say there's a rock out there. I don't know, you know, maybe there's a rock out there that's somehow somehow indicating to me its existence. And I have forms of intuition that are space and time that are structuring it. So I see it as a certain dimension away from me. I see it as let's say, kind of changing in its color as the day progresses, that type of thing. I see different categories. I see one, in terms of quantity, I see one rock, or maybe I see a plurality of rocks. That's all me. You know what I mean? Like, that's not the world. The world is this kind of, even kind of our own modern physics telling this is maybe just a bunch of photons hitting my eyeball, right? And I'm the one who's kind of piecing out that this is a rock and this is maybe one rock or a couple of rocks. And quality, I'm seeing that rock as its limits, its reality, and then its relation. I'm seeing, if I hit that rock, I'm seeing a causal relationship, and if they bounce off one another, I'm seeing its reciprocal action and reaction. So all of these are categories of the mind that are structuring reality. So what's important here for Wordsworth is that, and the upshot for Romanticism generally, is that this is a revolutionary sense of the power of the mind. So this is, I'm referring to this box up here. So there's the power of the mind to structure reality, or to restructure reality if we tap into imaginative faculties that have been ignored, okay? So we structure reality all the time. It's not necessarily the way things are. We have a certain lens over reality. Now the Romantics take this Kantian insight and say, well, what we need are different prophetic, imaginative visions of different ways of restructuring reality. And maybe that's your dull reality. That's the boring, bureaucratic, workaday reality of, got to pick up the kids, or routine and of rational causality. But I see colorful divinity in nature. I see freedom of spirit and expression. I see Age of Aquarius if I'm a 60s 60s druggie, so to speak, which is very much this romantic vision of the imaginative, prophetic insight into a different way of approaching the world. So on that note, let's look to these romantic aesthetics quickly. They're reacting against the neoclassical aesthetics of someone such as Alexander Pope, writing in the early to mid 18th century. So these neoclassical aesthetics they're trying to kind of live up to classical Greek and Roman, what they perceive at least as Greek and Roman rules. They favored emotional restraint, order, logic. The goal of art is not individual vision. It's to take a shared truth. So it's not individual vision. It's taking a shared truth and expressing it in a new and witty way. So Pope famously says in an essay on criticism, "True wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought, but never so well expressed." So it was oft thought. It was something everyone's thought of, but you just expressed it a bit more wittily than others. And so that's kind of the neoclassical. That's the neoclassical approach. And notice the rhyming lines. There's this sense of the forms, the poetic forms that are being adhered to as well. So in Lyrical Ballads, it's a book of poetry written by Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It was published in 1798 and really could be seen as starting off the Romantic movement in England. There's other movements in Germany maybe a few years earlier, but this really kind of set the movement off in England. Now, in the 2 years later, 1800 edition, Wordsworth attaches to that book of poems a preface, called a famous preface called the Preface to Lyrical Ballads, where he talks about some of the new and idiosyncratic poems or types of poems that are in the book that people had reacted to over the last couple of years. So it's a bit of a defense of their aesthetic, a bit of a defense of their approach to poetry in this book. And it becomes basically this manifesto for romantic poetry, and it has been ever since. So there he talks about the romantic poet is one that uses his or her imagination to transform the world and escape for it. So remember Kant here. And the imagination is godlike in terms of this structuring of the world. And there's also a description in there of poetry as this spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings of this subjective I, the subjective speaker, the poet. So lyric as the form that is best suited to the expressive lyrical I is a favorite of the Romantics. Wordsworth also says in Lyric Preface that he chooses in his poetry things from common life. So he's not going to use elevated heroes, elevated topics that the neoclassical poets had. And we can see in there a democratization of the topics or the subjects of poetry, just as the French Revolution would bring about a democratization at the political level. So this kind of the importance of imagination is that it's this idiosyncratic vision, and it's a faculty for producing new ideas out of images, combining old and new sense data into a new form. I'm not going to go into this, but if just for this aspect of it, in terms of the imaginative vision versus the rational vision, Shelley in his defense of poetry has a good summary there. And what the upshot of this is, too, is that it leads to a different sense of the goal of interpreting poetry. So this was really the insight of this critic named M.H. Abrams. And in one of those critical works that stands the test of time. So normally a work of literary criticism, is maybe has a shelf life of 5 years before someone it has interpreted the poem or the works differently. But this is a kind of one of those magisterial works that has stood the test of time. And the point of departure there is that he's pointing out that with the Romantics, we're shifting from a notion of the artwork as representing the world. So this pole, what he would call the mimetic pole of art as representing nature or the universe, let's say, shifting over to here, art as expressing the individual vision of the artist, okay? So in Hamlet, Hamlet was written before the Romantic innovation. So Shakespeare is writing in the same classical tradition. So the same as Virgil, same as Homer, they would have all thought that art is mimetic. It's representing nature. So if I write a poem, it's similar to if I paint a painting. It's showing you a picture of the world, and it's showing you it in such a way that you're going to notice the essence of that for the first time. Okay, so Hamlet famously says, the purpose of, he's talking to the players in Act 3, Scene 2, it's famous scene. So the purpose of playing, whose end both at the first and now was and is, to hold as 'twere the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her feature, scorn her own image, and the very age and body of the time his form and pressure. So the form of the object of playing, the object of drama there is to, just like poetry, is to hold a mirror up to nature, to represent nature and in doing so, to point out and highlight truths that may not be apparent, right? So now with the Romantics, it's not just kind of mirroring nature. It's not just mirroring what the already known that the workaday world that you see about you. It's the artist as expressing this individual and idiosyncratic vision of the world, okay? So if this is the work of art, this is the universe, this is the artist, and this is the audience. So there's different ways we can see as, let's say, the goal of interpreting poetry, or interpreting a novel, or interpreting a work of visual art or music, is to see it as a work and try to look at it for itself. So that's called this objective, interpretation, to focus only on the text, the work. Okay, so in literary criticism, there's something called the new criticism. So that's what they do. They want to look at the poem. They forget who the author is. They forget the historical context. They just look at the object, the work as object. Then there's, let's say, the audience. We can look at what's the effect on the audience. So different forms of that, reader response, but that's called a pragmatic poll, so to speak. We can look at in what way is the work highlighting or bringing forth the essence of nature, in this case human nature, probably, right? So it's when Hamlet says it's to show virtue her feature, he's talking about showing the play is holding a mirror up to human nature, right? So if we're representing human virtues, vices, these types of things, in what way has it brought it forth in a new way for the first time? Okay, so that's one way we looked at Virgil, right? And then we can look at the work as revealing something about the artist's vision. Now, in each case, what we're going to look for in the poem is different. So at the 19th century, because of this shift to an expressive notion of poetry, all of a sudden the biography of the poet becomes super important. Never was important at all before. Before that, no one really cared what Virgil's might have been eating or thinking. What did he have a bad childhood? Does he like to eat rice cakes in the morning, whatever. So after this, biographies of literary authors, of musicians, Beethoven, what have you, became more important, because maybe I'm going to get a clue as to the expressive idiosyncratic vision of the poet. And we have that today. We have that with kind of the romantic vision of the rock star or something like that, or the musician. I think, like there's something about, okay, boy, maybe if I get to know, I don't know any modern musicians, so I'm going to use somebody, Taylor Swift or something. If I follow her tweets, maybe I'll get a sense of what's going on in those lyrics. I think she broke up with so-and-so. Maybe that's what's going on. So that will give me insights into the song. That's the point of departure. Okay, so it's very similar, very, very much in this vein of Romanticism, of the work, just like the modern song, is an expression of this visionary artist. And I have to know the artist to know the art to some extent. So I'm going to quickly mention this age of revolution, so to speak, the French Revolution. We don't have enough time to really talk about this, but it's incredibly important for the Romantics in terms of taking the spirit of the Enlightenment and the notions of freedom and equality it spawned, and then trying to affect it. And in the sense that they could give history a fresh start was this really Jacobin belief. And Wordsworth, along with a lot of other young romantics, they were caught up in this revolutionary spirit, especially early on. And then Wordsworth, like many others, were turned off by the extremism that the revolution quickly went to. And this happens with so many revolutionary movements, even social revolutionary movements. They go from, we need to have equality and rights, to, well, we're never going to get equality until we have equality of outcome, and then we're never going to get that until the people who are against that are eliminated. Okay, so it starts off with so many revolutions with good intentions, but then goes to, let's say, the other extreme. And the French Revolution did this in the form of the Reign of Terror. So the Reign of Terror, basically kind of coming out of the spirit of Rousseau, really, his notion of the general will, and Robespierre, leader of the Committee for Public Safety, felt, we could really institute in the French Republic this enshrining of the general will, the will of all people, to kind of their self-directed end, if we got rid of those who opposed the general will. Okay, so they signed up orders for mass executions, the guillotine in Paris, and the provinces is the ever enduring image of this reign of terror. And in the end, executed close to 17,000 people. 10,000 people probably died in prisons awaiting execution. And this kind of thinking, begins, is the kind of thinking that leads to kind of the 20th century types of holocausts that you see, that the 20th century saw, that in terms of a utopianism of the general will, if we can just get rid of those who are not part of that general will. And the other way of mentioning it or thinking about it is that that kind of action would not be tolerated in the classical age, because there's a vertical limit. So whether it's thought of as God, or let's say the moral order of the cosmos, let's say if it's nature or a cosmological order that's above us, that's a vertical limit that's saying, don't do that. Don't murder other people to impose your views on them. Okay, so once that's disposed of, as it was with the Enlightenment, and replaced as it is with Rousseau with a horizontal limit. So the general will is, I can only, my actions are restricted by, what others want as well. So we have to accord with this general will. The limit to my action is now not above me, is not God, is not a natural order. The limit is now horizontal, and it becomes, let's say, less the kind of the moral limits on human depravity seem to be more easily overcome once that vertical limit is done away with. The other great revolution, of course, the Industrial Revolution of roughly 1760 to 1820. So there's an explosion of world economic output, and I think we see that in GDP per capita on the right, as one of the kind of indicators of that explosion of economic output. So increases the standard of living first of those in the West, and then there's been the kind of the trickle-on effect. So since then, so it's led to increasing the standard of living of everyone in the world to a great extent. Sure, there's still gaps, and they need to be done away with, but it has greatly improved people's lives, people's life expectancy, infant mortality. All these are great things, undoubtedly. So mothers are not dying to the same extent they did in childbirth, and infants are not, what is it, 1 in 3 would probably die just up till 150 years ago. That's just insane. So as someone who has kids, I can't even fathom that, So those have improved our lives markedly. Now, with the Romantics and what we still do today, I think in the wake of the Romantics, we also react against some of the let's say, the negative sides of the Industrial Revolution. So what happened is in the Industrial Revolution is it raised standard of living for all, but there was an increased disparity between the rich and the poor. Okay, something we see increasingly in the West as well, even today. There were kind of horrors, especially early on, of the factory system of child labor, these types of things. So these are things, the industrialization of the countryside, railroads, and these idyllic scenes that Wordsworth, this kind of worshiper of nature, he calls himself in Tintern Abbey, is going to react against as well. So Romanticism in some way is a reaction to the Industrial Revolution as well, as as dehumanizing us. In people, urbanization means millions of more people are going into the city where people are anonymous. It leads to a certain urban alienation. So the romantics are reacting against that as well. So there are these two strands again that we're living with today, between what I would call the romantic thesis of, let's say, technological and economic progress as somehow being dehumanizing. So it's had costs for the planet, had costs for our mental health, let's say, et cetera. So there's that narrative for sure. That's still with us. People questioning industrial economic progress because what it's doing to the planet, what it's doing to the stress of our lives, these types of things. And then there's still the counter narrative that says, well, look, you have to ignore a whole swath of benefits of life expectancy, infant mortality, of the security, the lack of conflict that we live with. A good summary of that side of the argument, and I find myself torn between both of those arguments. A good summation of this side of the argument is a book by Steven Pinker called Enlightenment Now. And I mentioned that one because I think this side of the equation we get in news and media more readily, but very few cogent defenses of the Enlightenment project. Okay, so I'm going to skip some of these romantic themes. We'll see them as we look at the poem. Okay, so and you can refer to them after the lecture as well. But here's one example of seeing the natural world in its exuberant and lively kind of energy. The romantic garden is wild, it's at the bottom, as opposed to the neoclassical garden, which is very much nature tamed, so to speak. And the romantic rebel, it's here on plate 6. I'll point it out that we have the quote that is one of the topics for the essay due tomorrow about Milton wrote in feathers when he wrote of angels and God. This is an example of Blake, really this one theme of the romantic rebel. That's a good instance of it. This, I'll just highlight too, this questioning the primacy of reason. Blake drew this visual, an English romantic poet, but also visual artist, of Newton at the right. So for the romantics, the rational perspective on the world it's true, and it reveals something, but it reveals a very limited view of it. Okay, so for Newton, he has a famous analysis of what light is, and he does experiments, with a prism and discovers that light is rays differently refractable. Okay, so he discovers that with the prism, you get these different colors, because he figures out that light is these waves of energy that are somehow, or rays he calls them, that are bent in different ways, and that's what gives us our light and our colors. So I guess the romantic point of departure is, does this sum up light? Is this if this were to think of the Platonic form of light, which would kind of include light as in illumination, a sense of brightness, a sense of the light that's in the hearth when you come home and it's a stormy night outside, or the way you experience the light, so to speak. Does this exhaust all the meanings of light and the possibilities for light? Or is it one kind of what Blake would call looking through kind of a narrow chink in one's cavern? So if we have a cavern and you're looking through this little hole in it to see, and that's the only way you can experience the horizon. So he depicted this. Newton, he has this beautiful cosmos all around him on the right. But what he does is, with his instruments, with his paper, he's just looking down at the ground. He's sitting on this rock. It looks like he's become the rock, like you can see his leg over here looks like it's coming out of the rock. It's ostensibly on the other side of some sort of protruding rock, but it's part of the rock, and his his ribs, look like kind of mirror the undulations of the rock. And he's so focused down here, he's missing this cosmos up here. Anyway, so this narrowness of vision is something that the Romantics would criticize. So I mentioned the kind of rise of history. If you haven't played around with this, I highly recommend playing around with this Ngram viewer, this that Google offers, but just an example of what's happening with what I would call the rise of history, towards the second half of the 18th century, and then really onto the 19th century. History is this overtakes eternal and temporal as categories of. So, well, first, let me back up. If you don't know what Ngram Viewer is it takes kind of millions of Google books that they've scanned, and books that have, what are the percentages of the books that have references to the words that you put in up here. So I put in those 3 words, and then books published in this period. Eternal was much more salient a word. It's used much more frequently than history in the 16th and 17th centuries, most of the 18th century, and then we can see history as a category super important beginning in the 19th century. Okay, so let's talk about the title. I mentioned at the beginning that the title is not Tintern Abbey, so that's our short form for it, because the actual title is much too long. Okay, so the actual title, as it appears in lyrical ballads, is lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour, July 13th, 1798. Very specific title, very specific title. So we get a lot there. We find out, let's see, what do we find out from the title? The time, so the actual date, July 13th, 1798. The place, the Wye Valley, Wales. So Tintern Abbey's just on the Wales side of that Wye River. The point of view, so he's above it, so he has a view of the landscape. And we learn in the first lines that he's in a secluded setting, it's quiet, and we learn that he's revisiting. So there's repetition in the lines. The first lines again appears 4 times in the first 14 lines. So he's revisiting this location. So the setting I mentioned is this Cistercian monastery. Under the dissolution of the monasteries, King Henry VIII, it began to be this ruin, and it has that evocation of the sublime. So the form and language, iambic pentameter, blank verse, just like Paradise Lost, but in a more common language. It's still ornate by our standards, but in the standards of poetry of that day, in a common language. And one thing you'll notice, let's say compared to Paradise Lost, is Paradise Lost has 18 footnotes for every line on, well, this is a reference to this Greek myth, this is a reference to the Bible here, this is it assumes a very learned reader, a reader who is going to catch a lot of these echoes, or at least catch the significance of them. Here, in Wordsworth's poetry, we don't have those very learned references. Okay, so that's kind of the context. With that, let's go to the first 22 lines, get a sense of this, see how it goes. Okay, so 5 years have passed, 5 summers, with the length of 5 long winters. And again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion, and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day is come when I again repose. Remember the again, all the 4 times in these first few lines. I'll just also back up. So 5 years have passed since the first time he was there. So he was there, say, 1793. Okay, so this poem, 1798, right? He's there He was there 1793. We know the poet's life. He had just come back from a visit to France in early years of the Revolution, and he left someone, a lover behind. So there's a kind of a tumultuous time for him. And once again, so the sense of repetition is quite good. Once again, do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs. So the landscape's the same, but we see through the poem that he's changed. Now, what's important is his change affects the landscape, right? So the landscape in an objective sense is the same, but in a Kantian sense, because he's different, he's shaping the landscape. So he and the landscape are, what he says later, are they co-create. Thoughts of more deep seclusion, so this sense of seclusion, and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. So kind of a double take there is, what sound does the sky make? You know, is the quiet sky is kind of a redundancy. The sky doesn't make a noise. You know, maybe clouds in the sky would make a noise if it were storming, but the sky as such does not make that noise. The day has come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees. So so he's looking out, he sees, you know, hedgerows, he sees, which are little lines from his perspective so far away. He sees pastoral farms, but we don't really see any people. So he's so secluded, but he sees perhaps a sign of people. He sees wreaths of smoke, and he can start to surmise what might be going on there. Sent up in silence. Again, the smoke, it's redundant to say it's silent, but it's pointing out, the poetry is pointing out what we might not notice. So that's the imaginative vision, right? So you see smoke all the time. I see smoke all the time. I see sky all the time. Okay. But what I don't notice maybe is that sky is quiet, you know, and that's smoke. It's green to the wreaths of smoke sent up in silence. Yeah. So I hadn't maybe noticed that it was sent up in silence. I hadn't noticed that adds to the seclusion of the setting. Say if I were in a similar perspective. From among the trees, with some uncertain notice, as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods. So he doesn't see houses around. So there's vagrants are wandering around. Some hermit, we'll see in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. So the hermit's alone, of course, because hermits, the definition of hermit. So sky is silent, you know, the smoke is silent, the hermit's alone, you know, it's highlighting what we might not have noticed at first sight. So the first lines give us this really kind of picture. It's a picture, it's sound. It's almost the smell, like the unripe fruits and those types of things. You need to smell these things in the scene of nature. It's all these senses working to bring the reader into this kind of point of view of this imaginative, kind of like The Wanderer, that painting, right? So the Wanderer, we as viewers are almost at the back of the Wanderer painting, seeing what the Wanderer sees. So too here, we're kind of looking over Wordsworth's shoulders to see, okay, this is this view. Let's try to take it in a tactile sense. And we're told that it underscores the silence of the situation, it's secluded, and this notion of repetition. Okay, so we'll go back here. By the way, he said he's under a dark sycamore. Dark sycamore is a very romantic tree. It's this kind of blotchy, you see them in horror movies when it's dark, and it's kind of mysterious, because it's got that white and pale with blotchy bark, and it does have that eerie look to it, that something's going on that maybe we don't know. It evokes the imagination. Very romantic tree, so to speak. So there's politics in the title. It doesn't jump out at first, and I can't remember when I first learned this, but it really kind of made me reassess the poem, because the poem's often taken as this, as I said, this aesthetic sublimation. Well, as the slide says, this aesthetic sublimation from history. But it's there. Okay, so what does that mean? So some people will say, well, this is Wordsworth going into some secluded aesthetic vision of the romantic artist, escaping and ignoring kind of the political problems of the world that are beneath him, and he's not noticing. So what's going on with those vagrants? That smoke from the smoke from the trees, what he's not showing is that this area is becoming industrialized. It was kind of displacing small peasant farmers. It was putting the peasants who were kind of sucked up into those industries, into those kind of exploitive industries. It was, tearing up their lives. He's not showing that. He's just showing nature and his own thoughts. And so the view of that critical perspective is that it's Wordsworth's way of kind of escaping or political economic realities of England at the time. But I wonder about that, So, well, first of all, I think there are subtle references to against the French Revolution, let us say. So first of all, Burke, as I mentioned here, had spoken of monks and monasteries as a fit objects of natural piety. And so dedicating the poem to Tintern Abbey would, at this time, could be seen as an homage to Burke and a praise of the English national character, in contradistinction to what Edmund Burke's writing against, which is the reckless nature of the French Revolution. Okay. Also, the date given there is, just one second, Jerry. The date given, July 13th, is eve of Bastille Day, which started the French Revolution back in 1789. They stormed the Bastille and started the events of the French Revolution. So there's all these subtle references, I think, in the setting to the French Revolution and being critical of the French Revolution. Jerry, did you have a question, Jerry?
Yes. I just wanted to ask about the Bastille Day, and you just explained it.
Okay, good.
Thanks.
So the other topic I want to raise here is this notion of nature and the sublime. So at an area where I mentioned, rural areas are being transformed into industrial centers. This kind of return to nature is to some extent a critique of that, is a critique of kind of modern economic rationality. So the speaker speaks favorably of even memories that he had of this scene during the last 5 years when he was in city settings. So he'll say, so since the last time I came, so 5 years ago I came, and this is the first time I've been back in 5 years. But in the intervening years, times where I've been in towns and cities, I've been refreshed by thinking about this moment and about this scene. Okay, so as we'll mention later, nature has this restorative power and is opposed to the life that humans lead in cities, in industrialized cities, in modern cities. in our modern kind of economic exchanges. So those kind of the rational way in which we need to undertake our day, because that's just the way it has to be done in a common sense, reasonable fashion, are called into question. So life in the towns and the cities we find is lonely and full of din in line 25. It contains selfish people with evil tongues and rash judgments and sneers, dreary intercourse of daily life. And those are just a few. There's many other references to that. And then by contrast, that, you know, what we see in nature as this overwhelming sense of awe and wonder. It's kind of the sense of the divine in encountering the natural world. And this awe and wonder evokes the sublime that we've talked about quickly. And he says in line 152, because of all this, he's a worshiper of nature. So the experience he has in nature is one of relationship to the divine. So a way of characterizing Milton's thought there would be panentheism. Okay, so so there's a subtle distinction there between the more common word is pantheism. People have probably heard that term, pantheism. So a subtle distinction between those two. So pantheism is that God is all things, okay? God is all things, or the divine is all things. They are equivalent, they are one, okay? So pantheism is that all things are God, and they are equivalent, okay? And then panentheism, so pan is all, okay? Theism is God, right? And then entheism, the N part would be in, so God in all, okay? So there's preserves an ontological distinction. So we can see God or the divine in all things, but there is a distinction. God is separate, but shows himself in all things, okay? And manifests itself in all things, okay? So because of this, because Milton sees the divine in all things, he's restored and is healed in these moments of being with nature, even, well, first of all, even if he just remembers it, but also in connecting now. So I won't read it, but in lines 23 to 50, you get this sense of, so the restoration, the healing of nature is physical and mental. It's like, so it's interestingly enough, I just heard this morning on CBC News, literally this morning, interview with a Carleton biology researcher who's just published a new study on the healing effects of natural sounds. So this is probably not totally new, but let's say, but there's new evidence undertaken by this Carleton researcher that using natural sounds only, they're apart from any other stimuli, health effects of these subjects improved as well, physically and mentally. So health indicators for both physical and mental improved. Coupled with other studies, the evidence shows that the more sense stimuli you have of the natural world, the better, right? So these subjects were only given earbuds with natural sounds of loons or whatever, right, on a lake. So if you can also smell the loons, if you can see the loons and they're right over there, and you have maybe the crisp feeling of the air on your skin, all of these, right, you're going to amplify that healing effect. So Wordsworth, and remember we talked about the first lines, when we looked at the first lines, we're getting that synesthesic, all that senses. For him, those are all important. And he, without doing the scientific research, seemed to be onto something there, that it does have a mental and physical healing effect, those sense stimulation of the natural world. It was also moral. So if you look at those lines, he says, something like it stimulates the best in us, in our best behavior, and spiritual in the way that we talked about how he's a worshiper of nature because it leads to the divine. Okay, so nature revitalizes the mind of the speaker, but the mind is not just perceiving nature, he's half creating or inventing nature. So that's line 106. That's what I was talking about before, about this Kantian relationship to the world as object. And the poet speaker is ode to memories of this scene, this rejuvenation that we've mentioned, and this kind of we think about emotions recollected in tranquility. So that's again from the preface to Lyrical Ballads. So he says that I have said that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. So the recollecting is what he's doing here in a way, right? He's recollecting moments that he had in the city, actually, where he was recollecting being there again, right? So the tranquil, the secluded scene allows him to recollect moments where he was recollecting being there before. So there's this kind of circularity there. So he says, but often lonely rooms amid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them in hours of weariness, sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the herd, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration. So there's these emotions recollected in tranquility. So the poem's about nature, but it's also about the speaker's past, present, and future selves, because it's about how the speaker has related to nature in different phases. So as a boy, he was kind of this natural, not really thinking through it, relationship to nature. And then as an adolescent, he could appreciate its beauty, but didn't really see the moral or divine aspects of it. And then now he's more mature and can see that it has this moral and spiritual element to it. And so ultimately the poems about this sense of the passage of time is like the sonnets, the passage of time leads to kind of loss, but it also means, with that passage of time, we can come and see what he says, see the life of things. I forget what line that is, maybe around line 50. We can come to see the life of things as we have a more mature appreciation of nature and how nature is this manifestation of the divine. So I want to end there and see if there's any questions about our reading tonight, Wordsworth, or the discussion of Romanticism generally. Okay, well, reminder, essay tomorrow. And okay, we have a question from Jerry.
Okay, you can just finish it. I can ask later.
No, go ahead. I've got you there.
Okay. I found it's very difficult to understand the points. Actually, I spent a lot of times on understanding from the background and unit, and I read a lot of references so that I can understand the points. It's like totally different from like what I'm reading from the high school. Well, I was reading some articles, but when I was in the university, I have to read the points.
So it's less, I guess, less of a question, but just an observation that you're finding the poetry more difficult to read than other works that you were reading in high school. Is that the point, Jerry?
Yes, I need to read a lot of references so that I can understand it.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you raised that. I think it's a point hopefully I made before, but if not, I'll make it again, because you're not the only one, right? I'm glad you raised it, because I'm sure there's a lot of people in the class that are feeling the same thing. When they read it the first time, read it a couple times, it's foreign syntax. It's the words are not quite used the way people talk in everyday language, right? So part of that's the point. Part of that's the point is to make us think about these things for the first time. And it does take a guide often to go through these works. That's why these courses are here. If it was just reading a newspaper article, it'd be a lot easier, right? And we wouldn't need to have a lecture about what was said in a newspaper article. So you're all in the same boat. It's they're more difficult to read than your average prose, so to speak, that you would get in journalism or what have you. Okay, so my advice is to keep at it. Read it, try to get a sense of it, continue to do what you're doing. Read there's a lot of stuff that when I was doing it, it wasn't as available. We didn't have the internet. That's how old I am. When I was doing it in undergrad. So I had to wait till lecture and try to figure it out, and it never did make sense to me. Now you have a lot of resources at your disposal. You have people doing videos on YouTube to interpret all these poems. You have blogs trying to interpret these poems. So any Google search will help you, or any search will give you kind of leads. Now, the thing is, you have to be tricky, right? Like that can be tricky too, try to sift through it, make sure they're reliable sources, right? But anyway, all that to say, keep at it and try to find resources that you can trust, and I'm sure it'll be worth your while.
Yeah, but Professor, that means while we are reading this point it's about the lines composed of a few miles, this should be like, instead of like the old points like from Shakespeare, which is Old English, but now it's like changing the style. It's more easier to understand while I'm reading it.
So I'm not sure I understood there. So were you saying that Wordsworth was easier than the Shakespeare to understand, or the other way around?
I think it's easier than the Shakespeare's.
Okay, yeah, I would agree with that. I think this is easier than Shakespeare generally. So Shakespeare is not Old English technically, so it's in early modern English. So but it's still a couple centuries removed from us, whereas Wordsworth is only 2 centuries, whereas again, Shakespeare's 4 centuries removed. This is only 2 centuries removed from us in terms of historical development of the language. And so there's the historical development of the language, but even sometimes if people are writing poetry today, often it's difficult to make out, let's say, the content of it, because the poetic expression, people are trying to use words in a new way to make you think in a different way about something that you're experiencing, right? So even if you read poetry written in 2021, you're probably gonna have to think about it, read it a couple times, and maybe what's that poet even on about, and part of the thing is there's really no one right answer to that question. So all that to say, Wordsworth, I would agree, is probably a little bit easier than Shakespeare, but still you've got to give it some patience. You've got to try to open your mind to that, and so keep it up.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Thanks, everyone. So I'll see you next week. We're gonna start one of 2 lectures on Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, an incredible 20th century novel that I hope you enjoy reading. See you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.